you are not entirely who you think you are. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that changes anything about your life, or the people you love, or the ordinary details of your days. But somewhere in the biology that makes you, you, there is a small fraction that came from somewhere unexpected. Someone who was not quite human in the way we normally use that word, but not quite not human either. Someone who has been gone for 40,000 years and is, in the smallest possible way, still here. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic way of talking about shared ancestry or the common roots of all life on Earth. It is a literal, measurable, scientific fact, confirmed by some of the most careful and painstaking genetic research ever conducted, verified by multiple independent laboratories, across multiple countries, using multiple different methods. Inside the cells of most people alive today, there are fragments of DNA that came from a different kind of person, a separate species, one that evolved alongside our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. They are called Neanderthals, and their story is one of the strangest, most quietly extraordinary stories that science has uncovered in the past 100 years. Not because they were monsters, not because they were primitive failures swept aside by a superior species, not because they represent some dark or violent chapter in human prehistory, but because they were real, genuinely, fully, complexly real, because they lived for an almost incomprehensible length of time in conditions that would test the absolute limits of modern human endurance, and because understanding them properly means rethinking almost everything that most people have been taught to assume about what it means to be human. That is what tonight is about, taking that story slowly, following it carefully, letting it settle. Before anything else, it helps to understand the scale of time we are talking about, because the numbers involved are large enough that they can slip past without really landing. Modern human civilization, everything from the first permanent settlements to the cities and networks and technologies of the world you are lying in right now, spans roughly 12,000 years. That is the entire arc of organized human society. The first agriculture, the first writing, the Egyptian pyramids, the Roman Empire, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century with all its chaos and invention, the Internet. All of it fits inside 12,000 years. Neanderthals existed for more than 400,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. They were not a brief experiment. They were not a rough draft that nature tried and then discarded once it worked out a better design. They were a long, genuinely successful, extraordinarily well-adapted species that survived conditions that no modern human population has ever had to face in quite the same way. And they did so not through luck or accident, but through accumulated knowledge, social organization, and cognitive capability that the old version of Neanderthal history simply did not allow for. The world they lived in was profoundly different from the world we know. For most of the time that Neanderthals existed, large parts of Europe and Western Asia were locked beneath glaciers. The ice sheets that covered northern Europe were in some places more than a kilometer thick. They advanced and retreated over the course of long cycles, tens of thousands of years each, driven by subtle variations in the Earth's orbit and the tilt of its axis. During the colder phases of these cycles, the landscape of Europe was transformed. Where forests now stand, there was open tundra. Where farmland now lies, there was permafrost. The sea levels were significantly lower. Because so much of the world's water was locked up in ice, and landscapes that are now beneath the ocean were then dry land. The animals that lived in Ice Age Europe were not the animals we know today. Woolly mammoths moved in herds across the cold plains, animals the size of modern African elephants but covered in thick reddish-brown fur and carrying enormous, curved tusks that could reach 4 meters in length. Cave lions, substantially larger than any lion alive today, hunted across the open landscape. Woolly rhinoceroses grazed on the sparse vegetation of the tundra. Cave bears, animals considerably larger than modern grizzly bears, occupied the same rock shelters and caves that Neanderthals needed for winter shelter. This competition for shelter with cave bears was not a minor inconvenience. It was a dangerous reality that Neanderthal groups navigated throughout their existence. This was not a gentle or forgiving world. It demanded everything from any creature trying to live in it. The cold itself was a constant and unforgiving presence in Neanderthal life. Winter temperatures in Ice Age Europe could fall to levels that would kill an unprotected modern human within hours, days shortening to just a few hours of weak winter light at higher latitudes. The landscape outside the cave or shelter, empty and frozen, food scarcer than at any other time of year. The group confined together in a small space for months at a time, and yet they survived this, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years, not just surviving, but presumably in their own way, living, maintaining the relationships and the knowledge and the practices that made group survival possible, finding ways to endure the darkness and the cold and the confinement. They were here through all of it, and the world was their home. They were built for the cold in ways that modern humans simply are not. The Neanderthal body was stocky and dense in a way that reflects hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection in cold climates. Their bones were significantly thicker than ours. The bone walls of a Neanderthal femur, the main bone of the upper leg, were substantially denser than those of a modern human of equivalent size, reflecting a level of muscular activity and physical load that modern human bodies are not routinely subjected to. Their muscles attached at slightly different angles than ours, giving them a different mechanical advantage, more suited to sustained effort over difficult terrain, to wrestling with large prey, to carrying heavy loads across long distances. A Neanderthal in their physical prime was almost certainly stronger than any modern human athlete. The bone stress markers found on their skeletons tell that story clearly. Their faces were distinctive in ways that set them apart clearly from modern humans, though not in the grotesque way that old popular reconstructions suggested. A heavy brow ridge, a continuous shelf of bone projecting forward above the eyes, gave the upper face a characteristic overhanging appearance. A large, broad nose, significantly wider than the typical modern human nose, served as an adaptation for warming and humidifying cold, dry air before it reached the lungs. In conditions of severe cold, breathing air that has not been warmed and moistened can cause serious damage to the airways. The large Neanderthal nose was, in effect, a more efficient heat exchanger, designed by evolution for cold environments. The skull overall was shaped differently, longer and lower and more elongated than the rounded dome of modern human skulls. And they had no chin, in the way that modern humans do. If you saw a Neanderthal today, you would recognize them as something human. The upright posture, the forward-facing face, the hands capable of fine manipulation, the social behavior, all of it would read as human in the broadest sense, but you would know immediately that they were not quite the same. The differences would be obvious and impossible to miss, not monstrous, not animal, but different in ways that would be striking and undeniable. The image most people carry of Neanderthals, that stooped, grunting, dim-witted cave brute is almost entirely a product of misunderstanding and the cultural assumptions of the era when Neanderthal research began. It is not what the evidence shows. It never was. And understanding why that image exists is actually part of understanding how science itself works. That image was constructed largely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it was built on a significant error. The skeleton that most influenced early reconstructions of Neanderthal posture was found at a site in France called La Chapelle-aux-Sens in 1908. The individual whose bones were recovered there was studied by a French paleontologist named Marcellin Boule, who produced an enormously influential reconstruction of what Neanderthals looked like and how they moved. Boule concluded that Neanderthals were stooped, bent-kneed creatures who walked with a shuffling gait. This reconstruction became the foundation for public understanding of the species for decades. It fed into museum displays, textbooks, novels, films, and the general cultural image of Neanderthals that most people still carry today. The problem was that the individual at La Chapelle-aux-Saints was old and severely arthritic. The arthritis had affected his spine and joints in ways that, when interpreted without accounting for the disease, made the skeleton appear to represent the natural posture of the species. Boule either did not fully recognize the arthritis for what it was, or did not appreciate its implications. When later researchers went back to the skeleton with better understanding of skeletal pathology, they found that the stooped posture was entirely a product of disease, not a characteristic of Neanderthal anatomy. Neanderthals walked fully upright. Their posture and gait were essentially identical to those of modern humans. This has now been confirmed across multiple specimens from multiple sites. The cave brute was always a fiction built on a misread skeleton. And that fiction shaped the way people thought about an entire species for 100 years. The tools Neanderthals made are one of the clearest windows we have into the kind of minds they had. Their tool technology is known as the Mousterian tradition, named after a rock shelter in the Dordogne region of France called Le Moustier. The Mousterian tradition spans the entire geographic range of Neanderthal occupation, appearing at sites from Western Europe across to the Middle East and into Central Asia, persisting for hundreds of thousands of years with regional variations and gradual development. These tools are not crude. They are not simply rocks bashed against other rocks until something sharp appears. They've required real knowledge, real skill, and real planning to produce consistently and reliably. And when you study them carefully, they tell you something important about the minds that made them. Neanderthals were selective about their raw materials in ways that reveal sophisticated planning. They sought out specific types of stone, flint and chert and quartzite and obsidian, materials with particular crystalline structures that allowed them to be worked in predictable ways, and that would hold a sharp edge through sustained use. They understood the properties of different materials and selected accordingly. They transported these materials across significant distances. Stone tools have been found at Neanderthal sites made from materials that came from sources tens of kilometers away. This means they were either carrying raw materials as they moved, returning to specific quarry sites, or exchanging materials with other groups. All of these explanations require forward planning. They require thinking about future needs. They require holding a problem in mind and working toward a solution before the need becomes urgent. One specific technique stands out for what it reveals about Neanderthal cognitive capability. It is called the Levallois technique, named after a suburb of Paris where early examples were studied. The technique involves a multi-step process of preparing a stone core before any usable tool is detached from it. The napper would begin by carefully shaping the core, removing flakes from around its perimeter, and across its upper surface until the core reached a specific three-dimensional profile. This preparation could take many strikes and considerable time. The useful tool had not yet been produced. What had been produced was a carefully prepared platform from which the useful tool could be struck with a single precisely placed blow. Then, at exactly the right point on the prepared surface, a flake of precisely the size and shape intended detaches cleanly. The tool was planned before the first blow was struck. All the preparation, all that time and effort and skill, was in service of producing a specific outcome that existed only as a mental image when the process began. You are engineering a result before you start achieving it. You are holding the finished product in mind. While working through all the preceding steps, cognitive scientists describe this as perspective reasoning, the ability to hold a mental representation of a future state and organize present behavior around achieving it. It is one of the cognitive abilities most clearly associated with sophisticated intelligence, and Neanderthals were doing it routinely, with a consistency that implies it was not exceptional behavior, but an ordinary part of daily life. Not a rare achievement, not an accident, but a skill passed down through generations. Refined over hundreds of thousands of years, their brains were not smaller than ours. This surprises almost everyone who learned about Neanderthals through older sources. On average, Neanderthal brain volume was roughly comparable to modern human brain volume, around 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. Some individual Neanderthal specimens had brain volumes slightly larger than the modern human average. The Neanderthal brain was shaped somewhat differently, more elongated from front to back, with the occipital lobes at the rear relatively larger, and the parietal regions somewhat smaller in proportion. What these structural differences meant for day-to-day cognitive experience and capability is one of the most genuinely open questions in the field. But here is what we can say with confidence. The old assumption that Neanderthals were simply less intelligent, that their brains were fundamentally inferior, it never held up. It was always more assumption than evidence. What we do know is what Neanderthals were actually doing in the world, and what they were doing requires significant cognitive capability. They hunted large and dangerous animals with coordinated group strategies. The prey they most frequently targeted was formidable, woolly mammoths, cave bears, larger than any bear alive today, woolly rhinoceroses, arises, the enormous wild ancestors of modern cattle, bison standing almost 2 meters at the shoulder. Taking down an animal the size of a mammoth is not something that happens through individual effort or good fortune. It requires planning the approach, coordinating multiple hunters, managing the direction of the animal's movement, anticipating its behavior under stress. It requires communication reliable enough to execute a plan under dangerous, unpredictable conditions. And it requires something else, something harder to name: the willingness to hold your position when a mammoth is moving toward you. Nerve. Trust in the people beside you. The evidence for this kind of organized, strategic hunting is preserved at kill sites across the Neanderthal range. At some sites, researchers find the bones of many animals of the same species, processed in ways consistent with systematic butchery by a group rather than opportunistic scavenging by individuals. The patterns of cut marks on bones reveal the sequence in which different parts of the carcass were processed, and those sequences are consistent with organized group work. At some locations, Neanderthals appear to have repeatedly returned to the same spots for hunting the same species over long periods, suggesting knowledge of animal movement patterns and the deliberate exploitation of landscape features, funneling animals toward locations where they could be more efficiently taken. This is not luck. This is not instinct. This is ecological knowledge, accumulated and applied across generations Analysis of Neanderthal bones themselves provides compelling evidence of how close their hunting took them to their prey. The pattern of injuries seen in Neanderthal skeletons is distinctive and telling. Fractures and healed trauma are concentrated in the upper body, particularly around the head, neck, shoulders, and arms. This pattern closely resembles the injury profile seen in modern rodeo riders. People who work in sustained, close physical contact with large, unpredictable animals. The implication is clear. Neanderthals were getting close to their prey. Very close. Engaging at ranges where the animal could fight back, and frequently did. The healed injuries are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of a hunting culture in which close contact with dangerous prey was accepted as a routine part of the work. These were not timid creatures. They were extraordinarily brave. Neanderthals controlled fire. This is established beyond any reasonable doubt from multiple sites across their entire geographic and temporal range. Earths appear consistently at Neanderthal sites. The burnt bone and charred plant remains and heat-altered sediment that mark a fire location, preserved across tens of thousands of years. They were not simply using fire when they happened to find it burning naturally. They were creating it, sustaining it, and using it deliberately for multiple purposes. For warmth, obviously, in conditions that required it for survival. For cooking, which improves the digestibility and nutritional value of both meat and plant foods significantly. And for a more sophisticated technical purpose, one that reveals something important about their understanding of material properties and cause and effect. The hafting process used by Neanderthals to attach stone tools to wooden handles required a substance called birch bark tar. Producing birch bark tar involves heating birch bark to a specific temperature range, around 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, in conditions where the bark can chemically break down without catching fire. In practice, this means controlling the oxygen available to the process, burying the bark under ash or soil, or using some other method to create an oxygen-limited environment while maintaining the necessary temperature. The temperature range matters. Too cool and the tar does not form properly. Too hot and the bark simply burns. Getting this right requires knowing what you are trying to achieve. It requires recognizing when the conditions are wrong and adjusting. It is a multi-step technical process that demands genuine understanding of cause and effect, not just repeated trial and error. Actual knowledge. They clothed themselves. We have no surviving Neanderthal clothing. Organic materials from 40,000 years ago generally do not survive. But the evidence exists indirectly. Analysis of cut marks on animal bones shows patterns consistent with removing hides for use, rather than simply for access to meat. The specific locations and orientations of cut marks, particularly around the extremities where removing hide cleanly is most difficult and requires specific technique, tell researchers something about how the skin was being handled and for what purpose. In an Ice Age environment, surviving even a single winter without effective insulating clothing would have been essentially impossible for a warm-blooded primate. The existence of Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe is itself evidence that they had solved the problem of staying warm. They wore the animals they hunted. They carried their warmth with them. They built shelters beyond simply occupying natural caves. At some Neanderthal sites, researchers have found arrangements of large mammal bones that appear to have been deliberately placed to form the structural elements of a constructed shelter. The bones of mammoths, heavy and durable and available in the landscape they inhabited, were used as foundation elements and structural supports in open landscapes, where no natural shelter of adequate size existed. The ability to construct shelter, rather than simply find it, changes what is possible in fundamental ways. It dramatically expands the range of environments a species can occupy, and the conditions it can survive. A group that can build, where it needs to be is far more flexible than one that must find what the landscape happens to provide. Neanderthals were not passive inhabitants of the landscape. They shaped it. To suit themselves, Neanderthals buried their dead. This single fact has generated more debate than almost any other aspect of their behavior, because it is not a trivial thing. The deliberate burial of the dead implies a relationship with death that goes beyond simple biology. It implies some form of recognition that the dead person is different from the living one who occupied the same body, and that this difference warrants a specific response. Whether that response was driven by grief, by ritual, by practical concerns, or by some mixture of motivations we cannot now disentangle. The behavior itself is meaningful, it requires explanation, and the most natural explanation, the one that fits most comfortably with everything else we know about Neanderthal behavior, is that it meant something to them, that the person who was gone mattered. The evidence comes from a substantial number of sites across the Neanderthal range. At La Ferracie in the Dordogne region of France, the remains of 8 Neanderthal individuals were found in what appears to have been a deliberate burial arrangement. Adults and children, positioned in specific orientations, some covered by stone slabs. The arrangement resists explanation as anything other than intentional. At Kebera Cave in Israel, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found placed in a pit, in a specific orientation, in a context that implies intention. At Roque de Marsalle in France, a Neanderthal child was found in what appears to have been a deliberately dug grave. At dozens of sites across Europe and the Middle East, the pattern repeats with enough consistency to establish it beyond reasonable doubt. They buried their dead. And they chose where? And they chose how. Shanidar Cave in Iraq is perhaps the most significant and most discussed Neanderthal burial site of all. The remains of at least 10 individuals were recovered there over excavations conducted initially in the 1950s and 1960s, and in more recent years, additional remains have been identified using modern techniques that allow the recovery of material that earlier work missed. Some of the individuals were positioned in ways that appear intentional. An early analysis suggested that pollen found near one of the burials might represent flowers deliberately placed with the body, which would represent remarkable evidence of ritual behavior. That interpretation has since been challenged, with some researchers arguing the pollen arrived through natural means. But the debate itself is revealing. The question being asked is not whether Neanderthals buried their dead. It is how elaborate and symbolically charged those burials were. That shift in the question tells you how far the science has moved. Beyond burial, the evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior has been growing steadily and is now difficult to dismiss. At Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, researchers found shells that had been deliberately perforated and coated with mixtures of pigments including yellow and red compounds. They appear to have been strung together and worn as personal ornaments. By any reasonable definition, they are jewelry. The dating of these objects placed them at around 115,000 years ago. More than 70,000 years before modern humans are thought to have arrived in that part of Europe. The creators were almost certainly Neanderthals, and they were making and wearing jewelry long before modern humans appeared on that part of the continent. That is not primitive. That is not what a creature without inner life does. That is self-expression. Reaching across 100,000 years, at La Pasallega Cave in northern Spain, geometric markings on cave walls have been dated to around 65,000 years ago. Ladder-like forms, lines, shapes arranged with apparent intention in specific locations within the cave. They are not the vivid figurative paintings found at later sites clearly associated with modern humans. but they are clearly deliberate marks, not random scratching, made by someone who chose specific places within the cave and made specific arrangements. When these markings were first studied, researchers assumed they must have been made by modern humans and that the dating must be wrong. Multiple independent dating efforts have supported the early dates. The scientific community has had to adjust its assumptions, and that is how science is supposed to work, not by protecting old ideas, but by following where the evidence leads. At multiple sites across the Neanderthal range, eagle talons appear to have been deliberately collected and modified. Eagles are not a significant food source. Their talons have no practical use in tool-making or food processing. And yet, at site after site, researchers find these talons showing specific cut marks consistent with careful removal from the foot of the bird, and wear patterns, consistent with having been strung and worn as pendants. The only plausible explanation is that eagle talons held some kind of symbolic or decorative significance for Neanderthals. The deliberate collection and modification of objects for non-practical purposes is one of the clearest markers of symbolic thinking that archaeology can recover. They were choosing things for their meaning, not just their function. That is a profound distinction. That is something we recognize in ourselves. The care Neanderthals extended to injured and elderly group members is one of the most quietly affecting aspects of their story. Shanidar 1. The individual from Shanidar Cave whose bones have been most thoroughly studied had survived for years, possibly decades, with multiple serious impairments that should have been fatal in an Ice Age environment. A crushing blow to the left side of his skull had caused damage that likely produced partial blindness on that side. His right arm had been severely damaged, possibly amputated below the elbow either by injury or deliberately. His right knee and foot showed damage that would have significantly limited his ability to walk effectively and contribute to group activities. He lived to middle age or beyond. With all of this, in an environment where physical capability was directly linked to survival, this individual could not have survived alone. And yet he did. Someone helped him. The care Neanderthals extended to injured and elderly group members is one of the most quietly affecting aspects of their story. Shanidar 1. The individual from Shanidar Cave whose bones have been most thoroughly studied had survived for years, possibly decades, with multiple serious impairments that should have been fatal in an Ice Age environment. A crushing blow to the left side of his skull had caused damage that likely produced partial blindness on that side. His right arm had been severely damaged, possibly amputated below the elbow either by injury or deliberately. His right knee and foot showed damage that would have significantly limited his ability to walk effectively and contribute to group activities. He lived to middle age or beyond. With all of this, in an environment where physical capability was directly linked to survival, this individual could not have survived alone. And yet he did. Someone helped him, someone fed him, someone protected him, someone chose, repeatedly, over years or decades, to extend care and resources to a member of the group who could not fully reciprocate. That is not instinct. It is not a behavior easily explained by evolutionary logic about protecting close genetic relatives. It is a sustained series of choices that prioritized the continued existence of a specific individual over pure resource efficiency. Whatever motivated those choices, the outcome is unambiguous. Whether we call that compassion, or loyalty, or love, the label is less important than the behavior itself. The behavior is unambiguous. Shanidar 1 could not have survived without sustained help from others. Others gave it. That is not the behavior of a species without an inner life. That is the behavior of people who understood that some things matter more than efficiency. Shanidar 1 is not an isolated case in the Neanderthal record. The broader fossil record shows a pattern of individuals surviving with injuries and conditions that would have required sustained care from others. Healed fractures that would have needed weeks of rest to knit properly. Conditions that would have significantly reduced mobility. Signs of illness survived in circumstances where survival required more than individual effort. The pattern, repeated across different sites and different time periods, suggests that caring for the vulnerable was not an occasional aberration in Neanderthal social life. It was a consistent feature of it, embedded deeply enough in their behavior to show up repeatedly. Wherever their bones are found and carefully studied, they looked after each other, not because they had to, but because that is who they were. Neanderthals had a sophisticated relationship with the plant world that went well beyond simply knowing which things were edible. Analysis of hardened dental plaque preserved on Neanderthal teeth, a substance called dental calculus that forms during life and can survive for tens of thousands of years in fossilized form, has revealed a great deal about their diet and their knowledge of plants. At multiple sites, this analysis has found evidence of cooked starchy plants, suggesting Neanderthals were processing plant foods in ways that improve their digestibility. They were not solely or primarily meat eaters in all environments. They were using the plant world with knowledge and intention. At Shanidar Cave, one individual's dental calculus contained traces of specific plants, including yarrow, groundsel, and ephedra. Several of these plants have recognized medicinal properties. Several are bitter and unpleasant to eat, which makes their presence harder to explain as casual dietary choices. That Neanderthals had accumulated practical knowledge of what different plants did to the body, and were applying that knowledge intentionally. This interpretation remains contested. The plants could have arrived in the mouth through other means. The evidence is not conclusive, but the fact that it is taken seriously, that researchers with rigorous standards are publishing papers asking this question, tells you something important about how dramatically the scientific understanding of Neanderthal capability has shifted. 50 years ago, the question would not have been asked. Today, it is being asked in serious journals by serious scientists. That shift in what is considered plausible is itself a kind of evidence. The question of language is the one that sits most centrally in the Neanderthal story, and the one that can least be resolved from the evidence we have, because language is the capability that enables so much else. The transmission of complex knowledge across generations, the coordination of sophisticated group activities, the development and maintenance of social relationships across distance and time, the capacity for the kind of abstract symbolic thinking that the evidence above suggests Neanderthals possessed. If Neanderthals had language in a form resembling ours, everything else about them becomes more coherent. If they did not, those same behaviors require different and more complicated explanations. The question is not academic. It shapes how we understand almost everything. And the honest answer is, we do not know. And we may never know with certainty. The physical evidence for language capability is present and significant. Their hyoid bone, the small bone in the throat that anchors the muscles used in producing speech sounds, was in a shape virtually identical to the modern human hyoid. Their vocal tract anatomy, reconstructed as far as possible from fossil evidence, suggests the ability to produce a wide range of sounds comparable to those of modern humans. Their hearing, reconstructed from the anatomy of fossilized ear bones, was particularly sensitive in the frequency range most relevant to human speech, between 2 and 4 kHz, where consonants and vowels carry most of their distinguishing information. Evolution does not produce specialized sensory sensitivity to frequencies that are never produced or attended to. The implication is quiet but significant. They were listening for something, and something was there, To be heard, the FOXP2 gene is sometimes described as the language gene. Though that label oversimplifies its role, FOXP2 is a gene involved in the fine motor control underlying speech production and in aspects of language learning and processing. Mutations in FOXP2 in modern humans cause significant difficulties with speech production and with language comprehension. The modern human version of FOXP2 differs from the version found in chimpanzees and other non-human primates in specific and well-studied ways. When researchers were able to extract and analyze DNA from Neanderthal fossils, they found that Neanderthals carried the same version of FOXP2 that modern humans carry, the same specific differences from the chimpanzee version. This does not prove Neanderthal language, but it removes one potential barrier to it, and it places the physical infrastructure in the same territory as our own. What we cannot access is the most important thing. The sounds Neanderthals made did not leave fossils. Whatever passed between members of a Neanderthal group, whatever sounds filled the air of those Ice Age camps and caves, is gone completely and permanently. No technology we have or are likely to develop could recover it. What we can say with confidence is that the complexity of Neanderthal social behavior required communication sophisticated enough to support it. Coordinated hunts require communication. Sustained care of the injured requires communication. The transmission of technical knowledge across generations requires communication. Whatever form that communication took, it was capable of supporting a highly complex social life across hundreds of thousands of years. The silence where their voices should be is one of the most profound absences in all of human history. Now, with the picture of Neanderthal life established as clearly as the evidence allows, we can turn to the question that shadows the entire story. Why did they disappear? The question seems simple. The answer, when followed carefully and honestly, reveals itself as a tangle of interacting factors playing out across thousands of years. No single cause was sufficient by itself. All of them together, combining and compounding, produced an outcome that may have been nearly inevitable once all the pieces were in place, but which required all those pieces to be in place simultaneously. Remove any one of them, and the story might have gone differently. That contingency matters. It means the disappearance of Neanderthals was not destiny. It was not the inevitable triumph of the better design. It was the outcome of a specific set of circumstances that might easily have been otherwise. The disappearance did not happen suddenly or dramatically. Neanderthal populations had been declining and fragmenting for a long time before the final disappearance. The fossil record shows a pattern of shrinking populations, increasingly isolated groups, a gradual retreat from the edges of their range over the period leading up to around 40,000 years ago. By the time the last Neanderthals were alive, they may have numbered only in the low thousands, scattered in isolated pockets across a continent they had once ranged across freely, cut off from each other by distance and by the presence of other groups in the territories between them, unable to exchange individuals, knowledge, or genetic diversity with other groups, vulnerable to any local catastrophe that a more connected population would have absorbed without crisis. The world that had sustained their species for 400,000 years had stopped working for them. Climate instability was a significant part of the pressure they faced. The period between around 45 and 30,000 years ago was one of marked climatic volatility in Europe. Temperature did not simply drop steadily, but fluctuated rapidly and sharply, with cold phases alternating with brief warmer periods over timescales of centuries, or even decades. These rapid fluctuations were disruptive in specific ways. The ecological knowledge that Ice Age hunter-gatherers depended on for survival, knowledge of where specific animals would be at specific times of year, which plant resources would be available in which locations through different seasons, was built up slowly over generations. Rapid climate shifts could render that knowledge unreliable faster than new knowledge could be accumulated and established. Neanderthals had survived far worse climate events in the long history of their existence. But those earlier crises had happened without another competing species moving simultaneously through the same territory, because modern humans had arrived in Europe. Our species, Homo sapiens, had evolved in Africa over hundreds of thousands of years. By somewhere around 45,000 years ago, groups of modern humans had begun moving into Europe from the south and east, following the river valleys and mountain passes and coastal routes into a landscape that Neanderthals had occupied for vastly longer. They were moving into occupied territory. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before the first modern human crossed whatever invisible boundary marks the continent's southern edge. The two species shared European territory for somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years, based on the best current evidence, long enough for extensive and repeated contact, long enough for the cumulative effects of competition to change the landscape of survival for both species. What that coexistence looked like from the inside is one of the great unknowns. We have no site where we can clearly see direct interaction between the two groups, no location where Neanderthal and modern human artifacts appear together in an unambiguous single-event context. The archaeological record is good enough to establish that both were present in overlapping territories at overlapping times, but not good enough to reconstruct what happened when a member of one group encountered a member of the other. Were there exchanges, trade, peaceful avoidance, conflict, indifference? Some mixture of all of these, varying by time and place and the specific circumstances of specific encounters? We do not know. We may never know. And there is something quietly haunting about that. Two kinds of people passing through the same landscape, and almost no trace of what happened when they met. Modern humans appear to have had structural advantages that accumulated significance over thousands of years of competition. One of the most significant was probably the size and reach of their social networks. Evidence from early modern human archaeological sites shows that they were maintaining exchange relationships with other groups across very wide geographic areas. Objects made from materials available only at specific distant sources appear regularly at modern human sites, in patterns that require some form of long distance exchange to explain. The same pattern is far less common at Neanderthal sites. Neanderthal groups appear to have operated within smaller geographic networks, exchanging information and materials across shorter distances, maintaining fewer connections with distant groups. A wider network means access to more information when local conditions fail, more support in hard times, more exposure to new ideas and techniques. Over thousands of years, that difference compounds into something significant. Climate instability was a significant part of the pressure they faced. The period between around 45 and 30,000 years ago was one of marked climatic volatility in Europe. Temperature did not simply drop steadily, but fluctuated rapidly and sharply, with cold phases alternating with brief warmer periods over timescales of centuries, or even decades. These rapid fluctuations were disruptive in specific ways. The ecological knowledge that Ice Age hunter-gatherers depended on for survival, knowledge of where specific animals would be at specific times of year, which plant resources would be available in which locations through different seasons, was built up slowly over generations. Rapid climate shifts could render that knowledge unreliable faster than new knowledge could be accumulated and established. Neanderthals had survived far worse climate events in the long history of their existence. But those earlier crises had happened without another competing species moving simultaneously through the same territory, Population dynamics may also have played a role in ways that are difficult to see directly, but straightforward to model. Small differences in birth rates, in child survival rates, in the age at which individuals first reproduce, compounded over thousands of years, produce enormous differences in population size. If modern humans had even a modest advantage in any of these parameters, perhaps from better access to high-quality food during critical developmental periods, perhaps from slightly more effective care for mothers and infants, the cumulative effect over 10,000 years would be dramatic. A population that grows slightly faster will, given enough time, simply occupy available territory more densely than a more slowly growing one. The slower growing population does not need to be eliminated. It just needs to be gradually, invisibly, quietly outcompeted for the resources that both require. Disease has also been proposed as a contributing factor, and the principle is biologically plausible, even if the direct evidence is limited. When modern humans moved out of Africa and into Europe, they carried with them pathogens that had evolved in the African disease environment over tens of thousands of years. Neanderthal immune systems, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of exposure to the specific disease landscape of Europe and Western Asia, would have had no prepared defenses against pathogens they had never encountered. We know from much more recent history how devastating this kind of pathogen introduction can be when previously isolated populations make sustained contact. The pattern is well established across many historical examples. Its role in the Neanderthal disappearance is speculative because the direct evidence is not preserved in bone. But the mechanism is sound, and it would not have needed to be dramatic to be decisive. The most honest answer to why Neanderthals disappeared is that no single factor was sufficient on its own. It was a convergence. Climate instability weakening populations at precisely the moment when a new competitor was arriving and expanding. Resource competition, adding steady pressure to groups already under stress. Possible disease, the compounding disadvantage of smaller social networks and narrower dietary range. Perhaps occasional conflict, not organized warfare, but the small-scale violence that occurs when any two groups compete for the same limited resources, each adding a small weight over thousands of years to a balance that was already tipping. The ending, when it came, was almost certainly not dramatic. It was the quiet arithmetic of population collapse, one small group at a time, across a continent too large for any individual to see the whole picture. The last fire went out without ceremony, and here is where the story takes its most unexpected and most significant turn. Because despite everything, Neanderthals did not simply vanish from the world without leaving a trace. Something of them survived the extinction of their species. Something persisted, invisible and unmeasured for tens of thousands of years, until the technology existed to find it. In 2010, a team of scientists led by Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a paper that changed the way science understands human history. They had sequenced the Neanderthal genome, reading the complete genetic code of an extinct human relative for the first time, and what they found changed everything. The feat required extraordinary technical ingenuity. Ancient DNA degrades over time. In bones 40,000 years old, the genetic material is fragmented into tiny pieces, contaminated with the DNA of bacteria and fungi that colonize the remains over millennia, and chemically damaged in ways that can introduce errors into any sequence that is read. Pääbo's team spent years developing new techniques for extracting, sequencing, and interpreting these degraded fragments. They worked with extraordinary care to distinguish genuine Neanderthal DNA from contamination introduced by the modern humans who had handled the samples. The result was the first complete draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. the first time in history that the genetic instructions of an extinct human relative had been read. And sitting inside those instructions was something nobody had expected to find: modern humans of non-African descent carry Neanderthal DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genome in most people of European or Asian ancestry is Neanderthal in origin. This finding has been confirmed by multiple independent research groups using different samples and different methods. It is not ambiguous. It is not a statistical artifact or a contamination issue. It is a clear, consistent signal in the genomes of billions of people. At some point during the period of overlap, Neanderthals and modern humans had children together. Those children survived and reproduced. Their descendants are alive today. If you are of European or Asian ancestry, you carry Neanderthal DNA in every cell of your body, right now. As you lie here, in the dark, listening to this, that ancient biology is part of you. The interbreeding appears to have happened multiple times, in multiple locations, over the thousands of years of coexistence. Genetic analysis of the distribution of Neanderthal ancestry across modern populations shows patterns consistent with several distinct episodes of mixing, not a single event. An early episode likely occurred in the Middle East, where modern humans first encountered Neanderthal populations as they moved out of Africa. Later episodes occurred as modern humans spread further into the Neanderthal range across Europe and Asia. Whatever the encounters between these two kinds of people looked like from the inside, some of them were sustained and close enough to produce children who lived, and those children had children. And that chain continued for 40,000 years, until tonight. Until you. That is not a small thing. That is a thread running from a world of ice all the way to this moment. Some Neanderthal genetic variants that persist in modern humans appear to have been genuinely useful. Several Neanderthal-derived sequences are associated with immune function, specifically with components of the innate immune system, the body's first line of defense against pathogens. These variants may have helped early modern humans survive in the European disease environment, which differed from the one they had evolved in over hundreds of thousands of years in Africa. Natural selection preserved these variants because they helped people stay alive and reproduce. The immune systems of modern Europeans and Asians are, in a small but real and measurable way, partly Neanderthal. Other Neanderthal-derived variants interact differently with the modern human genetic context, influencing aspects of metabolism, skin characteristics, and other physiological properties in ways that researchers are still mapping and interpreting. The inheritance is real, and in some cases, it is still working. There is a striking pattern in where Neanderthal DNA is largely absent in modern human genomes. Researchers have found that Neanderthal DNA is not evenly distributed across the modern human genome. There are specific regions, particularly regions associated with male fertility and with aspects of brain development and function, where Neanderthal ancestry is conspicuously rare or absent in modern humans. The interpretation is that hybrid offspring carrying Neanderthal variants in these specific regions had reduced fertility or viability. Natural selection removed those variants over time because the individuals carrying them left fewer descendants. The interbreeding happened. Its legacy is real. But the biological compatibility between the two species was not perfect. Some combinations worked and persisted. Others did not. The genome of every non-African person alive today carries the record of that imperfect but real union. Svante Pääbo was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for the work that made these discoveries possible. The Nobel Committee described the achievement as a revolution in the understanding of human evolutionary history, providing insights into what makes us uniquely human. by revealing the genetic legacy that connects us to our extinct closest relatives. Before this work, the standard model of modern human origins held that our species had replaced all earlier human populations without significant interbreeding. Neanderthals disappeared. We expanded. Two separate stories sharing a setting but not a genealogy. After this work, the relationship is understood as something more intimate, more complicated, more human than that. Not replacement, not separation, but encounter and connection, and something passing between two kinds of people that persists in the world today. The ancient DNA revolution that Pablo's work helped launch has continued to produce discoveries that no one predicted. It was through the same methods that the Denisovans were identified, a single finger bone from Denisova cave in Siberia, too small to identify anatomically, yielded ancient DNA that differed sufficiently from both modern human and known Neanderthal sequences to establish a completely new human lineage, a third kind of person, living in Central Asia at the same time as both Neanderthals and early modern humans, interbreeding with both, and also now gone from the world. One finger bone, and inside it, the entire existence of a previously unknown kind of human being, suddenly made visible for the first time. That is what this science can do now, and it is only beginning. Denisovan DNA persists in significant proportions in Aboriginal Australians, people from Papua New Guinea, and populations across Southeast Asia. A specific Denisovan genetic variant involving a gene that regulates how the body uses oxygen in low-oxygen environments still helps Tibetan people survive at high altitude without the physiological problems that most modern humans experience there. That variant was inherited from people who no longer exist as a separate population, still doing its work in the bodies of their distant descendants tens of thousands of years later. The full geographic range of the Denisovans is still being mapped. Evidence from their DNA appears in populations across a wide span of Asia and the Pacific, suggesting they were far more widespread than the limited fossil record so far recovered from a single cave might suggest. They were everywhere. And then they were gone. Like the Neanderthals, like all the others, the picture that has emerged from all of this research is one of extraordinary complexity. Human origins is not a single clean line from primitive to modern, from failed experiments to the one successful design. It is a web. Multiple populations, evolving in different places over different time scales, encountering each other across deep time, mixing and separating and mixing again. We are not the product of a single lineage that simply outcompeted all the others and arrived at us as the inevitable endpoint. We are a synthesis, a blend assembled from more sources and more encounters than the simpler version of history allowed for. And the Neanderthal chapter of that story is the one we know best, the one that sits most strangely in the imagination, and the one that changes most fundamentally what we thought we knew about who we are, because Neanderthals were the closest to us, the most similar in their physical form and in the complexity of their social lives, the ones whose inner experience, whatever it was probably closest to something we would recognize from the inside, and the ones whose disappearance is hardest to simply file away as natural and inevitable. Because nothing about the story suggests it had to go this way. The outcome depended on a specific set of circumstances that might easily have been different. In another version of events, the balance tips the other way. Neanderthals persist. We are the ones who failed to establish ourselves. The world would be unimaginably different. We are here because of contingency as much as capability. That is a strange thing to sit with, but an important one. There are still enormous gaps in what we know, and sitting with those gaps honestly is part of taking the story seriously. We do not have a complete skeleton from any single Neanderthal individual. We have bones from many different sites and many different individuals, assembled and compared, but no one complete picture of a single person. We do not know their social structures in any detail. We do not know how they made decisions as a group, what roles different individuals played, how disputes were handled, how knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next in practical terms. We do not know their family arrangements. We do not know their patterns of movement across the landscape. We do not know what they called themselves, or whether they called themselves anything at all. We do not know what it was like to be a Neanderthal. That question sits at the very center of everything, and science cannot answer it. Not because science is failing, but because some things simply do not leave physical traces. The inner experience of being a Neanderthal is gone with them, whatever they felt when a hunt succeeded or failed. Whatever passed between them around a fire on a winter night in a European cave, whatever they understood about the world they had lived in for so much longer than we have lived in ours. Whatever, if anything, they made of the darkness, and the cold, and the stars overhead, all of that is irretrievably and permanently gone. We will never know what it was, and that permanent silence is one of the most profound facts in all of human history. But we know they were there, and knowing they were there, really letting that land, changes something about how the deep past feels. The Pleistocene, the Ice Age world, is no longer simply a backdrop for the origin story of our own species. It is a place where other people lived, other minds, other kinds of awareness looking out at the same landscape, the same sky, the same darkness. The past is more populated than we knew, more full of different kinds of presence, more crowded with ways of being something like human than the version of history most people grew up with allowed. We were not alone back then. We thought we were, for a long time, but we were not. And knowing that changes the story entirely. There is a thought that tends to arise when you sit with the Neanderthal story long enough. The recognition that we are not the only version of human that was possible, that for almost the entire span of time that anything resembling a human being has existed on this planet, there was more than one kind, multiple lineages, multiple ways of being something in the broad category of human, multiple kinds of minds walking the same landscapes, breathing the same air, looking at the same stars. We are what remains of all of that. The last human species, the only one, walking through a world that once held others, mostly without knowing they were ever there. Until now. Until the science got good enough to find them, hiding in the bone and in us. This is one of the most important things that the study of Neanderthals has given us. Not just a correction of old errors, not just a more accurate account of a species that used to exist, but a different sense of the nature of humanity itself, a recognition that the particular way we are conscious and social and curious and meaning-making is not the only way that kind of existence has ever manifested on this planet. The universe managed to produce something like human intelligence at least twice on this planet that we know of. At least twice. The actual number may have been higher. Many of the traces may not have survived. We are not unique in the way we once thought. We are one version of something the universe has tried more than once. And that is a more interesting thing to be. The fossil record is incomplete in ways we cannot fully measure. There may have been other human relatives, other populations, other kinds of people, whose traces have simply not survived the tens of thousands of years between their existence and any possible discovery. Organic materials decompose, Bones are destroyed by geological process and time. The vast majority of individuals of any species leave no fossil trace at all. The Denisovans were identified from a single small finger bone. One fragment from one individual in one cave. The entire first understanding of that lineage rested, in its origin, on a piece of bone smaller than a matchbox. How many other populations existed and left nothing that has survived is genuinely unknowable. The world was once more full of different kinds of minds than we can currently account for. We are only beginning to understand how full it was. All of the ones we know of are gone now. Every human relative that science has identified, every population distinct enough to be characterized as a separate lineage, has either disappeared entirely or been absorbed into the modern human gene pool to such a degree that it no longer exists as a separate entity. We are the last, the only human species currently alive on this planet, walking through a world that once held others, mostly without knowing they were ever there. Until we developed the tools to read their stories in fragments of ancient bone and in the inherited chemistry of our own cells. That knowledge is less than 200 years old, and it changes everything about the story we tell ourselves, about what we are. The caves where Neanderthals sheltered are still there. Many survive. The caves in the Dordogne region of France, in the mountains of Croatia, in the hills of Iraq and Israel, in the valleys of Spain and Germany, where Neanderthal bones and tools and hearths have been found and carefully studied. A significant number of these places are still accessible, still standing, still dark inside, still cold, still carrying the particular silence of spaces that have been sealed from the outside world for a very long time. You could visit them, stand in the same places, let the same stone walls close around you. The air in those caves has barely changed. The darkness is the same darkness. The cold is the same cold. And the silence is the silence of everything that happened there and left no sound. Think about the fires that burned in those spaces on cold winter nights 40,000 years ago, and more. About the sounds that filled the darkness. Sounds of a species alive and present and going about the complicated business of surviving and living together. About the children who grew up, knowing those spaces as home, who learned to make the tools and tend the fires and track the animals and read the seasons and the landscape, who were cared for when they were sick, who buried their dead in those spaces, who sat with whatever that meant to them. About the life that was lived there, fully and honestly and without any awareness that it would one day be studied and debated and argued over by a different kind of person who came along much later and found the traces. There is something in that image that is difficult to hold without feeling some quality of loss. Not guilt, not grief in any personal sense, but something quieter and more diffuse. The recognition that something specific and real and irreplaceable was here and is now gone, and that the world is different for its absence. What was lost is genuinely difficult to name, not just a population of individuals, though that would be significant enough on its own, but a perspective, a way of experiencing the world that had been shaped and refined over 400,000 years of living in it. Whatever a Neanderthal heard when wind moved through a pine forest on a cold European night, whatever passed between them in the dark around a fire, that is gone, completely and irreversibly gone. And we will never know what it was. The science of understanding Neanderthals is still young and still moving. New sites are excavated every year. New analytical techniques are developed and applied to existing collections that have been in museums and universities for decades, revealing information that could not have been extracted when the bones were first recovered. Ancient DNA analysis continues to produce results that require existing theories to be revised and existing assumptions to be let go. The picture will keep getting clearer, and as it does, the figure of the Neanderthal will keep becoming more specific, more individual, less like a category, and more like a collection of actual people who actually lived actual lives in an actual world. That is the direction this science is moving. Toward the particular, toward the human, toward something that is harder to dismiss and harder to forget. The archaeological record of Neanderthal life is rich with details that the old version of the story simply did not include. At a site in Germany called Hohlfels, researchers found evidence of Neanderthals using plant fibers in ways consistent with the production of cordage, twisted rope, or string. Cordage is one of those technologies whose importance is easy to underestimate. It enables the binding of tools to handles, the construction of traps, the carrying of loads, and the building of more complex shelters. Whether Neanderthals were producing cordage routinely is still being investigated, but the evidence adds to a picture of material culture that is considerably more sophisticated than the old image allowed. Every new piece of evidence that emerges seems to do the same thing. It makes the Neanderthal story richer, more complex, more human than the version before it. The geographic range of Neanderthals was vast, and it is worth pausing to appreciate what that meant in practice. Neanderthals lived in environments as different as the cold, open plains of what is now Siberia, the warmer forests of what is now Spain, the semi-arid landscapes of the Middle East, and the cave systems of Central Europe. Each of these environments demanded different knowledge, different strategies, different solutions to the same fundamental problem of staying alive. That a single species could occupy all of these environments simultaneously, adapting its behavior to each without changing its underlying biology, tells you something important about the cognitive flexibility Neanderthals possessed. Behavioral flexibility on this scale requires learning, memory, and the ability to apply knowledge effectively in new and changing contexts. They were not rigid, they were adaptable, and they adapted. For 400,000 years, the question of how Neanderthal groups were organized socially is one that the record can only partially answer. What we can infer is that they lived in relatively small groups, probably of around 20 to 50 individuals. Groups of this size are large enough to support cooperative hunting and to provide enough individuals to care for the young and the injured, but small enough that every member of the group was known personally to every other. In a world without writing, without institutions, without any of the structures modern humans use to organize large-scale cooperation, personal knowledge was the foundation of everything. Trust was built through direct experience. Relationships were the infrastructure, everything that held a Neanderthal group together. Everything that made survival possible was built on the simple fact of knowing each other well, knowing each other completely. The transmission of knowledge across Neanderthal generations is one of the most interesting and least understood aspects of their existence. Modern humans transmit knowledge through language, through writing, through formal teaching, through demonstration, and through the accumulated cultural infrastructure of institutions and records. Neanderthals had none of the latter, and we are uncertain about the extent of the former. What they clearly did have was demonstration and imitation sustained over long periods. Tool-making techniques of the sophistication that Mousterian tools represent cannot be learned by watching once and copying. They require sustained practice under guidance. A learner who is motivated to acquire the skill and a teacher willing to invest the time to transmit it. That investment, repeated across countless generations, is how the Mousterian tradition persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. not written down, not recorded, just passed, hand to hand, person to person. The disappearance of Neanderthals left an absence that shaped the world in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate. For most of the time that modern humans have existed as a species, we have been the only human species on the planet. We evolved in Africa without contemporaries of comparable cognitive sophistication nearby. By the time we spread out of Africa and encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans, we were already a fully formed species with our own capabilities and our own established ways of doing things. The encounter with other kinds of humans lasted a relatively brief time in evolutionary terms, and when it ended, when the last of the other lineages had disappeared or been absorbed, the world settled into what we have since come to regard as the natural state. One human species, one kind of person, alone in a world that was not always so empty of others, that normalcy. The world with only one kind of human in it is historically anomalous. For most of human evolutionary history, multiple kinds of human-like beings shared the planet. The world of 500,000 years ago had archaic human populations across Africa and Eurasia. The world of 100,000 years ago had Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, modern humans in Africa, and possibly other populations not yet identified from the limited fossil record we have. Our current situation, one species alone, is the exception rather than the rule. We have simply lived within this exception for long enough that it feels like the only possible state. It was not always so, and knowing that means knowing that what we are is not inevitable. We are not the destination that evolution was always heading toward. We are one outcome among the several that actually existed. The genetic legacy of Neanderthals is still being mapped and understood, and continues to produce findings that no one anticipated. New research has continued to identify specific functions of Neanderthal-derived genetic variants in modern human populations. Some variants appear to influence how fat is metabolized. Others affect aspects of skin characteristics. Others are associated with immune responses to specific infections. Others appear to influence aspects of neurological function in ways that researchers are still working to characterize. Each of these findings adds to the picture of a genetic inheritance that is not just historically interesting, but functionally relevant. The Neanderthal DNA that modern humans carry is not a passive relic sitting inert in the genome. In specific cases, it is actively doing things right now in the bodies of the people who carry it. A 40,000-year-old inheritance, still at work, looking back at the long arc of Neanderthal history. What stands out most is not their disappearance, but their persistence. 400,000 years. In those 400,000 years, the climate shifted dramatically multiple times. The landscape of Europe and Asia was transformed and transformed again. The sea levels rose and fell as glaciers advanced and retreated. New species appeared and others went extinct. The world was not static. It was constantly changing in ways that demanded constant adaptation, and Neanderthals endured through all of it, adjusting, learning, teaching, rebuilding after losses, encountering crisis after crisis and surviving them. For 400,000 years they were here. The world was their home, and they managed to stay alive in it, against everything the Pleistocene could produce. That is not failure. That is one of the great survival stories in the history of life on Earth. There is a particular kind of strangeness to the fact that Neanderthal DNA persists in living people today. The Neanderthals are gone as a separate species. Their culture is gone. Their language, if they had one, is gone. Their way of life is gone. Everything that made them distinctively themselves as a people and a lineage has disappeared from the world. And yet, something persists. Something molecular and invisible and entirely outside the realm of memory. or story, or intention, a small fraction of their biology, woven into the genetics of billions of living people, still here, and still in some cases, functional. 40,000 years after, the last Neanderthal died without knowing they were the last. It is the strangest kind of survival, and the most real. They are gone, and they are not entirely gone. Both of those things are true. At the same time, there is a dimension of Neanderthal life that the archaeological record hints at, but cannot fully illuminate, and that is the question of how they understood themselves. Modern humans have a rich sense of self-awareness. We know we exist. We think about our own existence. We wonder about it. We build entire cultural and philosophical systems around questions of identity and consciousness and meaning. We tell stories about who we are, and where we came from, and what we are doing here. Whether Neanderthals had any equivalent of this is a question that cannot be answered from fossils and stone tools, but the behaviors we can observe, the care for others, the burial of the dead, the creation of ornaments, the collection of objects with no practical value, all of these suggest a species for whom existence had dimensions that went beyond the purely functional. A species that was aware in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. The experience of living through a Neanderthal winter must have been extraordinary in ways we can barely imagine. Temperatures dropping to levels that would be dangerous without shelter and insulating clothing. Days shortening to just a few hours of weak winter light at higher latitudes. The landscape outside the cave or shelter, empty and frozen. Food scarcer than at any other time of year. The group confined together in a small space, for months at a time, and yet they survived this generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. Not just surviving, but presumably in their own way living, maintaining the relationships and the knowledge and the practices that made group survival possible. Finding ways to endure the darkness and the cold and the confinement that we cannot now reconstruct. What did they talk about in those long, dark winters? What did they tell each other? What did they share? We will never know. When researchers study the Neanderthal fossil record in detail, one of the things that emerges is the evidence of individual lives. Each skeleton is a person. Each set of bones has a story embedded in it. The healed injuries that tell of accidents survived. The dental wear that reflects decades of using teeth as tools. The joint degeneration that speaks to a lifetime of physical labor. The pathologies that reveal illness endured. Shanidar I, with his withered arm and damaged eye. The old arthritic individual at La Chapelle-aux-Saints, whose misread bones shaped public understanding of an entire species for decades. The child at Roc de Marseille placed carefully in the earth. These are not data points. They are people. Each one of them was born and lived and died in a world that felt as real and immediate to them as this one feels to you. The world that Neanderthals inhabited was not silent. The Ice Age landscape of Europe was full of sound, the calls of the animals they hunted and the animals that hunted them. The wind moving through pine forests, the sound of rivers running through valleys carved by glaciers. The creak and crack of ice, thunder rolling across open plains. All of these sounds filled the world that Neanderthals moved through daily, and their own sounds filled the spaces they occupied. Whatever vocalization they used to communicate, whatever sounds passed between members of a group going about the business of daily life, those sounds animated the caves and camps where Neanderthal groups spent their time. The world they inhabited was alive with sound, and they were part of the sound of it. Their voices are the only part of that sound, that is gone entirely. The study of Neanderthals has changed science in ways that go beyond the specific facts about this one species. It has changed how researchers think about the relationship between biological and cultural evolution. It has challenged assumptions about the uniqueness of modern human cognition. It has opened new questions about what consciousness and self-awareness require, and what kinds of minds can produce what kinds of behavior. Most fundamentally, it has changed the question researchers ask when they look at evidence of ancient human behavior. The old question was whether a given capability was unique to modern humans. The new question is how similar to modern humans was this capability, and how different. The frame has shifted from uniqueness to a continuum. And that shift has changed everything, not just in Neanderthal research, but in how we understand the nature of the human mind itself. There is one more thought worth sitting with before this story is done. For most of recorded human history, we had no idea that Neanderthals existed. They lived and died and disappeared 40,000 years before the first written record of anything. For all the centuries of human civilization, for all the empires and religions and philosophies and sciences that arose and developed and transformed the world, the existence of Neanderthals was not known. We went about the business of being human, asking questions about where we came from, and what we were and why we were here, without any knowledge that another kind of human had walked the same planet so recently before us, without any knowledge that we were not the first, or the only, or the inevitable result. That knowledge is less than 200 years old, and it changes everything about the story we tell ourselves, about what we are. Tonight, you are lying in a world that Neanderthals never knew. A world of warmth, available at the touch of a switch, of information moving invisibly through the air, of a life so insulated from cold and danger and constant physical demand that the baseline conditions of Neanderthal existence are almost impossible to feel from inside it. And yet, some things remain the same. You are warm because something around you holds the heat in. You are part of a group that cares, in some way, whether you continue to exist. You are here because a very long chain of people managed to keep going, generation after generation, through conditions that were often far harder than anything most of us will ever face. That chain goes back further than you might have imagined before tonight, further than the first cities, further than the first agriculture, further than the earliest cave paintings, back through the hunter-gatherers of the late Pleistocene, back through the bands of early modern humans moving out of Africa into an unknown world, back through the encounters with other people in that world, the meetings, the mixing, the moments of contact that left traces in the genome still readable today, 40,000 years later, back, in part, to the fires in European caves, to the people who sat around those fires and cared for each other and buried their dead and, in whatever way was available to them, tried to make sense of the world they found themselves in. They could not have imagined you, and yet, in some small molecular way, they made you possible. That thread has never broken. It runs all the way from then to now, to people who were neither primitive nor perfect, who were something specific and real and now permanently unreachable, who lived fully in whatever way was available to them, in a world that has since been entirely transformed beyond recognition, who left something behind, not in memory, because no one remembered them for tens of thousands of years after they were gone, not in story, because their stories were never recorded in any form that survived, not in any form they could have intended or imagined, but in the quiet molecular language of genetics, in sequences of chemistry, coiled inside the cells of billions of people who move through their ordinary days, completely unaware that those sequences were ever anyone else's, that they carry something ancient and specific and human inside them, something that came from a fire, from a cave, from a world of ice. There is a concept that scientists sometimes use when they try to describe what it feels like to truly inhabit the scale of deep time. They call it the overview effect, borrowed from the astronauts who described looking down at the Earth from space and feeling, suddenly and overwhelmingly, how small and fragile and connected everything is. Something similar happens when you really sit with the Neanderthal story. When you let the 400,000 years land, when you let the reality of another kind of person, one who walked this same planet, looked at this same sky, sat in the same darkness, when you let that become real, the world becomes more populated, the past becomes more inhabited, and your own existence, brief and recent and contingent, becomes part of something much larger and much stranger than it seemed before. We are the ones who are still here. And that is not a simple thing. It means we carry a responsibility that no previous generation of humans understood fully, because no previous generation knew about the ones who came before. We know now. We know that the category of human is wider than we thought, that it has held other versions of consciousness, other ways of being aware, other kinds of people looking out at a world that demanded everything from them. And all of those other versions are gone, all of them absorbed or displaced or simply ended, leaving only us. What we do with that knowledge, how we carry it, is one of the quietly significant questions of this particular moment in human history. Not urgent, not dramatic, but real. We are the last ones, for now, and that means something. The Neanderthal story is not finished. Not because they still exist, they do not, but because our understanding of them is still growing, still changing, still producing surprises that require the picture to be redrawn. Every new fossil, every new application of ancient DNA analysis, every new study of the chemical traces preserved in 40,000-year-old teeth, all of it keeps adding to a picture that was almost entirely wrong 100 years ago and is still far from complete today. The figure of the Neanderthal keeps becoming more human, more specific, more real, and the distance between them and us keeps narrowing. Not because they were like us in every way, but because the ways in which they were different turn out to be subtler and more interesting than anyone once assumed. They keep surprising us, even now, even gone, somewhere in Europe. Around 40,000 years ago, a fire went out. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a fire that had burned for generations, quietly, slowly, stopped being lit, and the people who had gathered around it were gone. We do not know where the last fire was. We do not know when exactly. We do not know whether the last Neanderthal lived alone or with others, or whether there were even others left by then. We only know that at some point there was one, and then there were none. The last of an entire kind of person, gone without ceremony, gone without anyone knowing it was the end. Gone in the way that most endings actually happen, not with drama, not with witnesses, just with silence. Sleep well. The world outside is the same world it was when you began listening tonight, but perhaps it feels slightly different now, slightly more inhabited, slightly more ancient, slightly more full of lives that were lived here before yours. People who sat in the dark and felt the cold and cared for each other and left, at last, without knowing what they were leaving behind. You know, and knowing is the strangest gift. The world outside is the same world it was when you began listening tonight. But perhaps it feels slightly different now, slightly more inhabited, slightly more ancient, slightly more full of lives that were lived here before yours. People who sat in the dark and felt the cold and cared for each other and left at last without knowing what they were leaving behind. The story for tonight has reached its quiet end, but your journey doesn't have to. If you find yourself lingering here, in the space between wakefulness and rest, know that there is no rush. Stay here and allow the calm to carry you forward, and if your curiosity is still softly humming, another world of quiet knowledge is waiting for you on your screen right now. Let the next story carry you a little further into the calm, until the words eventually turn into dreams.